You have the look of a man who has been fighting.
And you have the look of a man who has been losing.
I have never lost. I have been temporarily defeated by enchantments. There is a considerable difference.
Where I come from, we call that spin. I used to write jokes like that for television.
You were a jester.
I was a comedian. I played the president of my country on a TV show called Servant of the People, a history teacher who accidentally becomes president and fights corruption. It was fiction. Then in 2019, 73% of Ukraine voted to make it real. 73%. I won by the largest margin in the history of Ukrainian democracy.
And then?
And then on February 24th, 2022, at 4 in the morning, Russia invaded with 190,000 soldiers. They expected to take Kiev in 3 days. The Americans offered me an evacuation flight. Do you know what I told them?
What did you tell them?
I need ammunition, not a ride.
That is the single greatest sentence I have heard since Cervantes put words in my mouth.
It was not a sentence. It was a decision. There is a difference. Sentences you can revise. Decisions at 4 in the morning with tanks 30 kilometers from your capital, those are permanent.
I know something about permanent decisions. I decided, on a Tuesday afternoon in La Mancha, that the world was full of injustice and that someone needed to do something about it. My neighbors thought I had lost my mind. My niece wept. My housekeeper burned my books. And I put on armor that did not fit, mounted a horse that could barely walk, and rode out to correct every wrong I could find.
And how did that go?
I was beaten by windmills, attacked by sheep, mocked by innkeepers, stoned by prisoners I had just freed. I was, by every measurable standard, a complete and total failure.
But you kept going.
Of course I kept going. The cause was just. The fact that reality disagreed with me was a problem with reality, not with the cause.
That is either the most inspiring thing I have ever heard, or the most dangerous.
It is both. That is what makes it interesting.
Let me tell you about my windmills. They were not made of wood. They were made of steel, and they came from Russia. In the first 72 hours of the invasion, Russia launched more than 160 ballistic missiles at Ukrainian cities. They hit apartment buildings, hospitals, a kindergarten in Okhtyrka. A kindergarten in the first week.
Giants disguised as windmills.
No, they were not disguised as anything. They were exactly what they appeared to be. The difference between your story and mine is that your windmills were never actually giants. My giants were always real.
You believe I was deluded?
I believe you saw injustice, and your mind turned it into something you could fight. A dragon, a giant, an enchanter. My mind did not need to transform anything. The injustice arrived with a flag and an army and 200,000 body bags.
And the world? What did the world do?
The world held meetings, extraordinary summits, emergency sessions. The United Nations General Assembly voted 141 to 5 to condemn the invasion. 141 countries said, "This is wrong." And then most of them went back to buying Russian gas.
I once freed a chain of galley slaves. 12 men chained together being marched to a fate they did not deserve. I broke their chains with my own hands. And do you know what they did once they were free?
Tell me.
They stoned me, threw rocks at me until I fell from my horse, took my belongings and ran. The people I saved attacked me for saving them.
That I understand. In 2022, some of the countries we were defending, the eastern border of Europe, the eastern border of NATO, were still debating whether to send us helmets. Helmets? We were fighting tanks, and they offered helmets. Germany initially sent 5,000 helmets. 5,000 helmets against the largest land invasion in Europe since 1945.
And yet you did not retreat.
We did not retreat. At Hostomel Airport on the first day, a few hundred Ukrainian soldiers held off an air assault by Russian special forces that was supposed to secure the airport for troop transports that would have taken Kiev within hours. Those soldiers were outnumbered, outgunned, and had no reason to believe help was coming. They held the airport. When the Russians regrouped and took it, a Ukrainian artillery unit destroyed the runway so no transport planes could land. That one decision, made by a commander whose name most people will never know, may have saved the capital.
That man understood something that I have spent my entire existence trying to explain.
What is that?
That the purpose of the fight is not the victory. The purpose of the fight is the refusal. The moment you refuse to accept what the world tells you is inevitable, that is the moment you become something more than what you were.
That is beautiful. And it is also what people say when they are not the ones being shelled.
That is fair.
I do not have the luxury of philosophy. I have a country with 44 million people and a border that is being erased. Every hour I spend thinking about the meaning of resistance is an hour I am not spending on air defense systems, ammunition supplies, diplomatic negotiations, and casualty reports. The meaning of resistance is that people stop dying. That is the entire meaning.
I had Sancho Panza. He was my only ally. A simple man who followed me not because he believed in my cause, but because he believed in me. Or possibly because I promised him an island. I was never entirely certain which.
I had the international community, which is like having a Sancho Panza who gives long speeches about how much he supports you while standing very far from the windmill.
That is painfully accurate.
In the first year we received promises. So many promises. Weapons would come, sanctions would cripple the Russian economy, the world was united. And some of it was real. The Javelin missiles, the HIMARS, the intelligence sharing. I will never deny what was given. But there was always a gap between the words and the weapons. Always a delay between the promise and the delivery. And in that gap, people died.
Sancho once told me that the problem with my adventures was not that I fought giants. It was that I fought them before breakfast, without a plan, and with a lance that was already broken. He said the cause was just, but the method was insane.
Sancho was right.
Sancho was a practical man. The world needs practical men. But practical men do not charge windmills, and sometimes charging the windmill is the only thing that changes what is possible.
On February 25, 2022, the second day of the invasion, I recorded a video on the streets of Kiev. At night, with my chief of staff and my prime minister and my senior advisors standing next to me. I held up my phone and I said, "We are here. We are in Kiev. We are defending Ukraine." It was 42 seconds long.
42 seconds.
That video was shared more times in 24 hours than any political statement in the history of social media. Not because of what it said, because of what it proved, that we had not run. Every intelligence agency in the world expected me to be in Poland by morning. The Russians had sent assassination teams, the Wagner Group, Chechen special forces, specifically to kill me. And I stood on the street with a phone and said, "We are still here."
You know what Cervantes would have called that?
What?
A quixotic act. An act so unreasonable that it becomes its own kind of reason. The world expected you to flee and you refused. Not because fleeing was wrong, it was arguably the rational choice, but because staying changed the meaning of the war. It was no longer Russia against Ukraine. It was a giant against a man who would not move.
Do you know how many Ukrainian soldiers have died?
I do not.
Neither does anyone, with certainty. The estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000, and that does not count the civilians, the children, Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol. The theater in Mariupol had the word children written on the ground in letters large enough to be read from space. They bombed it anyway. 600 people were sheltering inside.
I have no words for that.
Good. There should be no words for that. Words are what people use instead of action. I have sat in rooms with world leaders who wept at the photographs from Bucha and then went home and continued buying Russian oil. Tears without action are the most obscene form of cowardice I have encountered.
In my story, there is a moment when I am lying on the ground after being beaten, again, and Sancho asks me why I continue, why I do not simply go home and live quietly. And I tell him something that I believe with every fiber of my being. I tell him that the greatest madness a man can commit in this life is to let himself die without a fight.
Cervantes wrote that.
Cervantes wrote it. I live it. And apparently so do you.
Can I ask you something personal?
I am an open book, literally.
At the end of your story, in the second part, you regain your sanity. You lie in bed and you tell everyone that you are no longer Don Quixote. You are Alonso Quijano, a reasonable man, and the adventures were madness. And then you die.
Yes.
Was that a relief?
It was the cruelest thing Cervantes ever did to me. He gave me clarity at the exact moment clarity was fatal. As long as I believed in the giants and the enchantments and the mission, I was alive. The moment I became reasonable, I had no reason to continue.
I think about that. More than I should. There are nights, and I will not say how many because a president should not admit to this, when I wonder what happens after. When the war ends, however it ends, when the speeches stop, when the world moves on to its next crisis and Ukraine becomes a paragraph in a history book, what happens to the man who is useful as a symbol, but is just a person underneath?
You are describing the most dangerous moment in any quest, not the battle, the morning after.
Before the war, I was a comedian. I made people laugh. I was good at it. I loved it. I had a wife, 2 children, a production company, a life that made sense. Then I became a wartime president, and everything that came before became a footnote. The comedian who became a president, as if the comedy was the prelude and the war was the real thing. But what if the comedy was who I actually am, and the war is the role I play?
I was a country gentleman who read too many books about chivalry and decided to become a knight. Everyone says the madness was the problem, but the madness was the only part of my life where I was completely, fully, unapologetically alive. The sanity at the end was not a cure, it was a death sentence.
Winston Churchill won the war and lost the election 6 weeks later. The British people loved him as a war leader and dismissed him the moment they needed something else. De Gaulle left France twice. Lincoln was shot. Mandela spent 27 years in prison and then was expected to forgive everyone in an afternoon.
The world loves its heroes for a very specific amount of time and then finds them inconvenient.
My approval rating in Ukraine was over 90% in the first months of the war. 90%. No leader in history maintains that. It is mathematically impossible. The same people who cheered will eventually criticize. That is not betrayal. That is democracy. But knowing it intellectually and living it are different things.
Sancho Panza loved me, genuinely, and even Sancho eventually doubted. He followed me across Spain, was beaten, humiliated, blanket-tossed at an inn, and through all of it he stayed. But there were moments, quiet moments, when he thought I could not hear, when he wondered if I was worth following.
Everyone who follows a leader into something impossible has that moment.
And every leader who asks people to follow them into something impossible knows they are having it.
Let me ask you the question I have been avoiding.
Please.
Was it worth it? The riding, the fighting, the losing, the madness, all of it. Knowing how the story ends, with you in bed, sane, dying, and everyone around you relieved that you finally stopped. Was it worth it?
You first.
I cannot answer that yet. The story is not over. People are still dying. Cities are still being rebuilt. The war continues in ways the world has stopped paying attention to, because there is always a newer crisis, a louder headline, a more convenient tragedy. I cannot tell you if it was worth it, because the cost is still being counted.
That is the most honest answer anyone has ever given to that question.
It is the only honest answer. Anyone who tells you a war was worth it before the last grave has been dug is selling something.
Then I will answer for myself. Yes, it was worth it. Not because I won, I never won anything. Not because the world changed, the windmills are still standing. It was worth it because for a brief and magnificent time, a man who had no business being a knight became one anyway. And 400 years later, people still argue about whether I was mad or the world was.
You know what keeps me going, honestly?
Tell me.
The faces. Not the speeches, not the strategy meetings, not the diplomatic victories. The face of a woman in Kherson the day we liberated the city. She was standing in the street holding a Ukrainian flag that she had hidden in her basement for 8 months of occupation. 8 months she kept that flag folded under a floorboard, and when our soldiers arrived, she stood in the rain and held it up, and she did not say a single word. She just stood there.
She was your Dulcinea.
Who?
The woman I loved, or rather, the woman I invented to love. A peasant girl from a village near mine whom I had never spoken to and who did not know I existed. I transformed her in my mind into the most beautiful and noble lady in the world, and I fought every battle in her name.
She was not real.
She was real to me. And that is what I have learned in 400 years of being a character in a book. The thing you fight for does not need to be real. It needs to be true. There is a difference so large that most people never see it.
The woman in Kherson was real. The flag was real. The 8 months were real.
And the country you are fighting for, the version of Ukraine that exists in your mind, the one that is free and whole and at peace, does that Ukraine exist right now?
No, not yet.
But it is true.
Yes, it is true.
Then you are not mad. You are simply early.
That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me since this started.
I have had 400 years to practice. Same non-time tomorrow?
I cannot promise tomorrow. I have not been able to promise tomorrow since February 2022.
Then we will meet when we meet. And until then, do not let them tell you the windmills are not giants.
They are not giants.
No, they are not. But the man who fights them anyway, he is something the giants will never understand.